Now, someone asked me a question about my YouTube video, well, one of my videos, saying, how do you get your narration sound? What do you do? What processing do you use to make it loud and make it present and all that sort of thing? And kind of how do you sync up the picture and the audio and all that sort of thing? So I thought I'd talk through that. Now, one of the reasons I'm going to make this video, apart from irritating my brother, who always says you make too many YouTube videos about making videos on YouTube about videoing yourself for YouTube. So what I use is some very old equipment. When I mean very old, I mean, you know, older than 5 or 6 years or so. And actually, all of the stuff that I've got is old stuff. I don't use mega expensive things. So I have here an iPhone 4. Now, bizarrely, this is quite good in low light. Better so than its successor, the iPhone 5. But basically, what happens is when you've got a camera, when you've got a phone that's got a video camera on it, like these two, as soon as the contract's over, the device is yours. So rather than it go into landfill, I use them to make my multi-angle videos. You're watching this on another iPhone 5. Also, this one, the iPhone 4, has a little metal disc at the top, which I've glued on to the phone, and that allows you to fix this little wide angle camera attachment. Now that, I think I paid £2.70 or something on eBay for that. It's really useful. My studio is only small, so if I want to be able to see a wide angle, perfect solution. You can get the clip-on ones as well, these little lens and a clip, and that will go across my other phone if I need more wide angle things. There we go. Also, I always video in widescreen rather than portrait. If you use it like that, obviously you'll get a tiny band on YouTube, and you don't want that. You want everything in portrait. Now, this purports to be 1080p in terms of picture quality, and yeah, it's good. They're pretty useful. However, I wouldn't go as far to say it's worthy of the 1080p storage. The lens is only tiny, so it doesn't really matter if it's going to be 720p, which is what you're watching this on. So that's a little bit about the cameras that I use. Now I make little attachments that go on to microphone stands. Why do I do that? Well, it's much more stable and adaptable than a camera stand. So what I do is I buy these little spring-loaded clips like this, that just hold a phone like that. There we go. Now, you can buy these for 99p. Now what I do is I get you can see there's a little brass knurled sort of screw thread thing which comes with a mic stand. When you buy a mic stand like this, you always get a little disc with it so that this thing doesn't slide down and go inside the barrel of the mic stand. So what I do with that is I drill a tiny hole through it and then bolt a clip. Seems a bit draconian and a little bit sort of sledgehammer to crack a nut, but it really works. And then you just put that onto your mic stand and you have multi-angle capability, wherever you are in your room. So, and I've got a few of these mounted up in just various points to attach a camera to. So there is the video camera bit. There's the phone you're watching this on has another one of these clips, and it's pretty stable, as you can see. When you set the thing to video, press and hold the screen until a little banner comes up saying AE/AF lock. You think, what was that? Auto exposure, auto focus lock. So once you set that, it just will video. It won't make any adjustments of its own, which is actually ideal. So it's not constantly refocusing or the pictures sort of changing size. You don't want that at all. So moving on to the audio side of things, I've got here an SE3300, which is a large diaphragm condenser mic. It's possibly one of the sort of more expensive things that I use, but they're only about £180, and if you're in your music game anyway, you'd have something like this. However, if you're making videos about anything else and you don't want to splash out on a mic, on an expensive mic, you could get something like this. This is the Zoom IQ6, and it has a little connector that allows you to plug it into an Apple iPhone. That's really good because it means you can record your audio on this and then you can drag your audio and video later. If you've got something like this is the Zoom H2. It's years and years old, but it sounds great. You just set that up to record, and it has a little memory card which can then go in the side of your computer and you can download your audio that way. I'm currently recording the audio onto a 12-year-old MacBook here, which still works. It's absolutely fine. However, I do have a multi-input sound card which does allow me to record something like the output of this, which is an iPad. So when I'm making my iPad demos, I can have something like, I can have sound from this playing at the same time. And there we go. So if I'm making a multi-angle thing, like you can see my face, and you don't want to see my face, and then another phone which is trained on my iPad, I can then bring both of those things in on the iMovie program that I've got on my other computer. Now, that's an old computer too. It's made in 2010. So I'm making most of the stuff that I'm using to make my YouTube videos is over 10 years old. So you don't need to go the whole hog. Of course, if you've got an SLR digital camera, which has got like super duper video quality, great, use that. But for demos where you're just looking at a screen, such as the iPad, you can use an old phone. It's fine. I always use a phone or a video camera on the iPad. I'm not such a fan of the screen capture, which you can do on this newer iPad. I prefer to see fingers pressing buttons and pointing, because it's actually what, you know, if you're making a tutorial, it's what your tutee will be doing. They'll be following finger movements and buttons and all sorts of things like that. So the next part, I'm going to show you what I do on the computer in order to process the audio. So in the second part of this presentation, I'm basically going to show you about the audio side, the audio recording that I've made. Now, once again, I've got my mic here and I've got the output of the computer, and I'm actually mixing onto another machine. I'm a musician, so I have old bits of kit, and what you're actually listening to now is the presentation as recorded on a machine that was made in the late 20th century. So yet another old piece of kit. So I've got the vocals that I recorded, just the original narration, and on the track below I've got the brief sort of foray into my iPad audio. So I've got these two things running together, and the object is to mix them and also do a little bit of processing. Now, if I press play on the vocals here from the last thing, how do you get your narration sound? What do you do? What processing do you use to make it loud? It's quite quiet at the moment. We don't want that. We need the thing to be loud enough that it competes with the advert that comes before it. Now, the classic loudness war, you know, it's there. You know, if it's an advertising thing, it needs to be loud so that you take notice of the advert. It's not just the picture, it's the sound as well. So I'm going to apply some compression to this. Now, a compressor, what it does is it compresses the loudest part of the signal while not affecting the bottom part of, or the quiet part of your signal. Now, in practice, what that means is that you can apply a compression and then ramp the gain up, or ramp the volume of your voice up. So also what I tend to do with a mic like this that's got a large diaphragm, I tend to first of all, cut the very lowest bass end off. So maybe somewhere, cut everything below about 80 to 100 hertz. I'll leave it at 85. There we go. So that's a plug-in on this, which is Logic Pro 7 from 2003. So another old bit of kit. Now, after the equalizer, I'm going to put a compressor in. Now, what that does is it makes the voice louder. One of my videos saying, how do you get your... Now, there's a little telltale meter here which tells me when the compression is being applied. Now, there's a threshold command, a threshold setting here, which I'm going to lower so that the compressor kicks in earlier. narration sound. What do you do? What processing do you use to make it loud and make it present and all that? Now you can hear that the vocals are a little bit more constant in terms of their volume. We have another control here called ratio, which sets the essentially how much compression is applied at a given threshold. So I'm going to turn it up. I usually go for about 4:1. That sort of thing, and kind of how do you sync up the picture and the audio and all that sort of thing. What I don't want to happen though is for the thing to be squashed and sound like some really awful radio broadcast. So you've got to be a bit careful. With the meter here, I tend not to allow it to compress by about more than 6 dB. Otherwise it really pumps, and I'll give you an example of that. So I thought I'd talk through that. Now, one of the reasons I'm going to make this video becomes very tiring to listen to when you have something like that. So I'm going to just be a little bit careful. Apart from irritating my brother, who always says, okay, so that's the part about irritating my brother. Now, there's a little spike here. I'm not sure what that was. It was another sound or something. I'm just going to go and have a little listen to that. So what I do is I buy these little spring-loaded clips like this. Okay, now I obviously made a bit of a noise with that spring-loaded clip that I was showing you. So I'm going to zoom in on that, and you can see that there's a big spike here which I've got to get rid of. Now, at the moment, this iPhone 4 is videoing the screen of my computer, and what you're watching on this iPhone 5 is the little thing in the corner, and my third part of this is basically dragging all of this together and making the video, making the actual finished product. So my best bet with this is not to cut that sound out, because you'll notice a sort of a sudden drop in level, and we don't really want that. We want a sort of a constant sort of soundtrack, but with reduction in the case of spikes like this. Now I can on most audio programs now, you can have automation which allows you to change the volume. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to just ramp the volume down just on the peak of that sound. Let's see what that sounds like. So I buy these little spring-loaded clips like this that still a bit present, and it's partly because the compressor is still acting on that sound. So I'm going to just bring it down even further. Let's try -30. I mean, that's very low. So I buy these little spring-loaded clips like this that just hold the phone. That'll do. You know, it becomes clearer. If you're listening to this without a picture, you think, oh, what's that noise? Whereas if you can see the spring-loaded clip actually snapping back, it doesn't matter so much. So I'm fairly happy with the rest of it. What I usually do is go to the loudest section of vocals and just double check my compression isn't too harsh. Now what I do is I get you can see there's a little brass knurled sort of screw thread thing which comes with a mic stand when you buy. Okay, so I've just made a few little settings on the compressor just to act on that loudest bit. Now that's essentially the entire soundtrack. Now I'm going to go and see how loud that iPad is with respect to my vocal. So I'll just close the compressor on that, and now I'm on this track here at the same time. I can have something like, I can have sound from this playing. Now for some reason the compressor made a little bit of an error here, because I've actually played with a compressor while I've been viewing the track automation. While I've been adjusting the compressor, it's actually stored, I think, some of my settings. Compressor. No, it hasn't. Okay, the compressor's obviously had a little funny 5 minutes and decided to. So when I'm making my iPad demos, I can have something like, I can have sound from this playing at the same time. Now, you could hear the output of the iPad separately on my vocal mic. Now I want to cut that out so that you can hear just the iPad. So what I do with this is I isolate the vocal mic track just where the iPad starts and ends, and then I actually just delete that. So if I play that back now, it's playing at the same time. Now you can only hear the iPad. So what I also tend to do is I would bring the vocals right up to where the iPad starts, or slightly afterwards, and put a little fade. Displaying at the same time. And then do exactly the same at the other end, so that it doesn't sound like the vocal mic has been switched off, because it's been hidden by the fact that the iPad is playing. And there we go. Now I've got to obviously equalize the level of the iPad so that it sounds roughly at the same level as the vocals. So I've got my channel control here. Let's see what happens now. Something like I can have sound from this playing at the same time. Now my third track here I've actually got set to be the output of the computer, so that I can see the level of the overall output, and that's what I want to see really, because that actually makes a massive difference to your overall level on YouTube. I can have something like so actually it could be a bit louder than this. Now what I tend to do is I put a limiter across the main output and then ramp up the gain of the limiter until it just briefly limits the very top signal. So you'll hear the overall level actually increasing quite a lot now. Record something like the output of this, which is an iPad. So when I'm making my iPad demos, I have this. A boy is born. And there we go. Now I'm kind of getting to that point. I'm getting to that stage now where actually this is kind of work. Now when I prepare the video for this from the soundtrack, I will use this part as the loudest signal, and then everything else should basically work alongside that. So now I've got that, I prepare a stereo audio file by just finding where the thing begins. Now notice that breath. I use the breath. I'm just going to cut at that point and get rid of everything that came before. Now I will put a fade on the beginning of that. Now I'll always leave a little bit of space at the beginning so that you can drag it with respect to the video on your iMovie or whatever you're using afterwards. Now someone asked me, there we go. So if I go all the way to the end now, I can do the same thing. It's the audio. There we go. I'll just put a fade at the end. The computer in order to process the audio. There we go. Now basically what I do is then make a bounce of that and then call it, I don't know, YouTube vid part 1, and then I store that as an audio file. Now notice that I don't do any compressing at this stage. I don't make it into an MP3 or anything like that. I keep it as a PCM file, pulse code modulation. It's essentially a CD quality file, or full quality. 16-bit is not full bit depth, you can have 24, but YouTube does do some compression, so don't go hammer and tongs with your audio, but make sure it's good enough. And then I shall click bounce, and then that essentially the computer then does its rendering of that audio file. Notice that even on an old computer like this, where this has never seen the internet, by the way, it's still pretty capable of giving you a pretty good speed in terms of rendering your file. You can still buy these computers. It's the MacBook of 2007, I think, and because you can still buy them, that must mean there's something right with them. Lots of companies sort of refurbish them, put new memory in, or a new hard drive, or a new CD drive. You can get them on eBay pretty good, £200 or £300. That's cheap. So I've saved that, and I'm going to quit that, and then the next part is going to be the actual production. Now in the third and final part, I'm sat in another room, so you can hear that my narration's a little bit different. So you've got to bear that in mind as well when you're narrating. You've got to think about the room you're in and damp any reverbs or anything. Now here I've got the computer and I've dragged in, you can see that I've got 3 camera angles here, or 3 cameras. This is part 1 where I had 1 camera. Then part 2 I had 2 cameras. So if I drag in, first of all, my intro, I've got to work out where this starts and where to bring my audio file in. So if I just press play on here,
one of my videos set.
Okay, so if I basically know where I'm coming in,
someone asked.
Okay, so I basically split the clip here. Get rid of everything that came before it. Now the audio you're hearing at the moment is from the camera. So now I'm going to drag in just the part 1. There we go. We've got YT vid part 2 and part 1. Part 3 is in progress, and that's this. So I will be doing the same with this to render this on the same movie. So here is the audio for part 1, which appears as a little green band. Now, for those of you using this version of iMovie, it's quite an old version. I'll just, here we go, iMovie 09. Yeah, it's not even this decade, but it still works perfectly.
Someone asked me a question.
Now, you can hear that the audio is basically out of alignment. So I've got to trim the little green audio file, which is my louder one, in order that it fits with the camera. So if I just try that. So this is a bit of trial and error. There are no sort of measurements here or time code or any of the professional things that filmmakers have. But I'm basically just doing it both by eye and by listening.
Someone asked me a question.
That's not bad, but at the moment...
Someone asked me a question about...
The audio file, I've actually trimmed it slightly too much because the audio is actually slightly ahead of the camera. Or rather, the audio that I want is slightly ahead of the camera. So let's just try that once again.
Someone asked me a question about my YouTube video.
Now, if you get a small delay like that, all is not lost. I'm just going to adjust the audio on the camera and actually switch it off completely. Now I'm going to watch this and see if my voice and what I'm hearing basically work.
Someone asked me a question about my YouTube video. One of my videos saying...
That's good enough for me. Okay, now, that's all good. So the next part, I'm going to drag in another part of the... I'm going to drag in the next camera angle, and you can basically see how that sort of works. Now, I've just got to make sure also that the end of the video here lines up with the end of the audio.
On the computer in order to process the audio.
Okay, so now I can basically cut that at the end, like so, and there we are. So the next thing, I'm going to now have the next part of the video, which is where I did the audio cutting, this one. This is going to be the small window, and this is going to be the large window. So basically I drag this in. There we go. So this is the next part, and find out where it basically starts again.
So in this...
Okay, that's pretty soon after the start of the camera. So I'm just going to bring in the resolution so that it's essentially much higher scale.
So...
Okay, so I'm going to keep the breath at the moment because I do want a natural pause between these two sections of my video. So I'm just going to get rid of that little piece. And then I'm going to drag my part 2 video in. There we go. Here's part 2. And there we are. So part 2 is...
So in the second part of this presentation, I'm basically...
Now, the at the moment, the camera and the audio, the main part of the audio is actually slightly behind.
So in the second part.
So I've got to drag this. I've got to trim this so that this matches the camera. Let's see what happens now.
So in the second part of this presentation.
That's good enough for me. Now, I take the audio of that camera down, like so. Now I've got to bring in the other angle of my sort of looking at the camera, and basically you can see my computer there. So I'm going to drag this to the beginning of that file, then go picture in picture, and then I can position this where I want, and I'm going to put it probably up here, up at the top there, and I can resize. Now I've got to make sure that that second camera angle actually makes sense with the start of the video. So I've got to make sure that I also cut that off the end there, so that I can drag this to the point where it's essentially the other angle starts. Now this can be a little bit tricky unless you've got the scale right up, so I'll just make sure. There's my first bit, there's my second bit. I'm going to drag this to the beginning here. There we go. Now, of course, a computer can be a little bit sluggish with video because it's hugely memory intensive. So I've got to work out, I've got to clip the small picture here, I've got to clip that with respect to the other camera. So I'm basically going to just... There we go, it's about there.
So in the second.
Okay, I've clipped that. I can bring this right to the beginning. Just increase the scale so that I've got a nice fine control. Notice that I'm just dragging stuff really just by eye. There's nothing here that's sort of, I haven't got any time code or any sort of reference from the cameras. And indeed, this can be an issue if you've got audio and video. They can actually come out of alignment. It's not usually a problem until you get to, 10 or 15 minutes or so, when suddenly your voice will look out of sync with respect to the with the soundtrack. But let's see what happens now.
So in the second part of this presentation, I'm basically going to show you about the audio side.
So there's a slight discrepancy there, so I've got to get the clip trimmer back out. And I'm going to just try it a little bit further here, because it sounded like the camera audio was delayed with respect to the actual soundtrack. No, it was actually the other way, because that came in quite a lot earlier. So I've got to drag that back this way. There we go. So that's my adjustment there, and see what happens with that.
So in the second part of this presentation, I'm
not far off, but it's just slightly lagging now, so I just need to take a tiny bit off there.
So in the second part of this presentation,
it's actually not quite there. Just going to drag a couple of frames there.
So in the second part,
there we go. Okay, so this can be quite time consuming, but once you've got it all in place, essentially, as long as the video isn't all that long, you should get away with the alignment of video and audio.
So in the second part of this presentation,
there we go. And that is basically how I do it. Now, you can, of course, you can add your text, you can drag your text over, but that is essentially how I get this to work. And then when I'm ready to export, I go to Share, Export Movie, and then make sure that it's HD, or it's basically as big as I can make it. And as you can see here, it's got a 720p resolution. The second figure is the sort of the resolution, and it gives you a little bit more info, like how big the file is going to be. So always keep it as high quality as you can, and YouTube will essentially do the all the compression for you. and make sure that it works across all platforms, Windows machines, whether it works on an Android phone or an iPhone or a PC or an Apple Mac. And that is how I make my videos.